I realize that, but these boxes have to be moved today.
I appreciate that, but the sign right there says HOA movers. You know the regulations as well as I do.
When I finally moved into my new home, a peaceful, non-HOA property sitting at the edge of a quiet suburban neighborhood, I felt like I had won a battle I'd been fighting for years. A battle against endless rules, petty inspections, and the constant feeling that someone was always watching me. So stepping onto my driveway that morning, boxes still unopened, the smell of fresh paint still lingering around the porch, I felt a freedom I hadn't tasted in a long time. But that freedom lasted exactly 7 minutes, because that's when Kevin, the self-appointed watchdog of the adjacent HOA community, marched down the street with the confidence of someone who owned not only his house, but apparently mine as well. His arms stiff at his sides, sunglasses on even though the sun was behind the clouds. And before I could even say hello, he stopped at the edge of my property and barked, "You can't be here," which would have been funny if he didn't look so serious. So I wiped my hands on my jeans and said, "I live here." But Kevin shook his head like a disappointed father and replied, "That's impossible. This area is protected under our community standards." And I explained politely, trying not to laugh, that my house wasn't part of his HOA, that it legally sat just outside their jurisdiction. But he puffed his chest and said, "Everything on this street falls under our HOA." And I could already tell this was the kind of man who argued with Google Maps, the county recorder's office, and probably his own mirror. So I just smiled and told him to enjoy his morning, which somehow offended him enough that he stepped 1 foot over my property line like a territorial pigeon trying to prove dominance. I calmly told him to step back, but instead he leaned in and hissed, "You need to pack your things and leave before this gets messy." Which only made me laugh out loud, because nothing motivates me more than someone trying to control me on land they don't own. So I walked back to my porch, ignoring his hollow threats. But Kevin wasn't done. He stayed there another 5 minutes, muttering aggressively into his phone, pacing back and forth like I had committed some crime by paying for my own house. And it was in that moment I realized that this move, which was supposed to bring peace, was going to bring something very different, something chaotic, dramatic, and honestly entertaining. Because if Kevin thought he was going to push me out of a home I legally owned, then he had no idea who he was dealing with. And as I went back inside to keep unpacking, I could hear him yelling down the street to someone else, probably another HOA loyalist he wanted to recruit into whatever crusade he thought he was launching. And while I didn't know exactly what was coming next, I knew Kevin was the kind of man who didn't give up easily, which meant this fight was only beginning. And what I didn't know was that by the end of the week, Kevin's obsession with controlling my property would blow up into something far bigger than either of us expected. Something that would make him regret ever stepping onto my driveway. But Kevin's next move would prove he was willing to escalate things far beyond petty arguments.
The next morning, just as I stepped outside with a cup of coffee, expecting a quiet start to the day, I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps marching with purpose. And sure enough, there was Kevin, but this time he wasn't alone. He had brought reinforcements. 2 other men from his HOA board, Mark and Jason, both wearing matching navy polo shirts like they were part of some self-important task force. They stopped right at the edge of my property, huddled together, whispering as if they were preparing a military operation, and then Kevin stepped forward and cleared his throat dramatically, announcing, "We have reviewed the situation and determined that your presence here violates the standards of our community." Which was hilarious for many reasons, the biggest being that I did not live in their community. And I told him that again, firmly but calmly, but Kevin held a folder of papers like he was a county official and flashed them at me, though he never opened them, probably because they contained nothing but printouts of HOA bylaws that applied to everyone except me. Still, he insisted that my house falls within the influence radius of the HOA, a phrase he clearly invented moments earlier. And Mark chimed in, trying to sound authoritative. "If you don't comply, we may need to issue fines," and I nearly joked on my coffee, asking, "Fines from who? Monopoly Money HQ?" Which irritated Jason, who stepped forward and warned, "This community takes standards very seriously." But the more they talked, the more obvious it became that none of them actually understood property boundaries. So I walked them to the edge of my driveway, pointed to the metal marker in the ground installed by the surveyor, and said, "Everything from this marker inward is mine, not yours." But Kevin crossed his arms and replied, "We have decided that marker is incorrect." And I realized I was dealing with men who believed feelings were stronger than legal documents. Still, I didn't want this turning into a shouting match so early in the morning, so I suggested they confirm with the county records office before accusing me of illegal residency, which made Kevin sputter with frustration because he clearly expected me to be intimidated, not logical. After a moment of awkward silence, they walked away, but not before Kevin dramatically snapped a photo of my house like I was some kind of criminal. And I knew that picture would be plastered all over whatever email newsletter the HOA ran, probably with a dramatic caption like, "Unauthorized occupant threatens community standards." And as they retreated, I noticed him pointing at my truck, my porch lights, even my mailbox, as if they were documenting violations to write up later. I shook my head, grabbed my coffee, and went back inside. But deep down I sensed this wasn't over, because men like Kevin don't give up after 2 confrontations. They escalate, they plot, they look for any possible angle. And sure enough, later that afternoon, when I went out to check my mail, I found a bright orange notice taped to my box stamped with HOA compliance warning, even though I was not, had never been, and would never be under their authority. And that's when I knew Kevin had officially declared war. And the next step he took was so outrageous, it pushed me from annoyed to ready for battle.
By the time I pulled the bright orange HOA compliance warning off my mailbox, I could feel my patience thinning. But I wasn't about to let Kevin drag me into his imaginary jurisdiction without at least trying to handle things the right way, so I snapped a picture of the notice and drove straight to the county office, a place I knew would shut this nonsense down quickly. The clerk, Mr. Harris, a calm older man with glasses that slid down his nose every time he looked at a document, listened as I explained the situation, and after one raised eyebrow and a quiet, "Oh boy, one of those cases," he pulled up the property map on his computer and confirmed that my house was indeed completely outside the HOA lines, not even touching the border, which meant Kevin had absolutely zero authority over my land. So Mr. Harris printed out the official zoning map, the recorded plat, and a letter confirming I was not under any HOA governance, all stamped and sealed. And I left the office feeling confident that this would put an end to the foolishness. But confidence is a dangerous thing around people like Kevin, because when I returned home, clutching my paperwork like a shield of truth, I found him standing right in the middle of my front yard, pacing with a clipboard, muttering to himself as he inspected my porch, my driveway, even my grass height, as if he were conducting a full-blown inspection. I walked up and asked calmly, "What are you doing on my property?" And Kevin didn't even look embarrassed. He just said, "I am documenting violations for the board." And I nearly laughed because his boldness was so absurd it felt like a prank. So I held up my county documents and said, "Here, this is from the county. I'm not in your HOA." But Kevin didn't even read them. He skimmed the top page, scoffed, and said, "These don't override our community authority," as if the HOA were the Supreme Court. And before I could argue, he reached into his folder and pulled out a second notice, this one bright red, and slapped it onto one of my porch posts, declaring, "Final warning, vacate immediately," which was hilarious considering it had been less than 48 hours since I moved in. I told him this was harassment, and he replied, "Only if you think rules are harassment." Then added, "You should be grateful. We maintain high standards here." And that was the exact moment I realized logic wasn't going to fix this, because Kevin wasn't motivated by rules or rights, he was motivated by control. And nothing threatened a man like him more than someone he couldn't control. So I told him, firmly, to leave my property immediately. And after a tense stare down, he strutted away, muttering something about calling in backup, but I didn't know what that meant until later that evening when I looked out my window and saw a sheriff's vehicle turning onto my street and Kevin guiding the deputy toward my house with the enthusiasm of someone reporting a major crime.
And I knew Kevin's backup wasn't paperwork, it was law enforcement, which meant things were about to escalate far beyond fake warnings and useless notices. But what Kevin told the sheriff was such a wild lie that even the deputy had to stop and question everything. When
I saw the sheriff's vehicle pulling up with its lights off, moving slowly like the deputy was trying to piece together the situation before even stepping out, I took a deep breath and walked outside, wanting to be calm and clear-headed. But before I could say a word, Kevin practically sprinted toward the deputy, waving his arms and pointing at my house like he was reporting an armed standoff. The deputy, Officer Collins, a tall, even-tempered man with a shaved head and a look of someone who had seen enough nonsense in his career to recognize more of it coming, stepped out and said, "Sir, what exactly is going on?" And Kevin launched into the most ridiculous story I had ever heard, claiming that I was an unauthorized occupant, that I had illegally taken possession of a property owned by the HOA, and, my personal favorite, that I was refusing to vacate after repeated official notices, which was so absurd that Officer Collins actually turned to look at me with a slow blink, like he needed a moment to reset his brain. I kept my hands visible and said calmly, "Officer, I own this house. I have the deed, mortgage documents, and county verification on my kitchen table." And before I could say more, Kevin interrupted, practically shouting, "Those documents irrelevant! This residence is under our authority!" And Officer Collins raised his hand to silence him, then said to me, "Sir, do you mind if I take a look at your paperwork?" And I nodded, motioning toward the porch, while Kevin hovered behind the deputy like an anxious mosquito buzzing in circles. Once inside, I laid out every document neatly: deed, closing papers, county plat, the zoning map, even the letter from Mr. Harris, and Officer Collins read through them carefully, pausing several times to make sure the parcels and boundaries matched. When he stepped back outside, he looked at Kevin and said, "This property is not in your HOA." And Kevin's face twisted like he'd bit into a lemon, but instead of accepting reality, he doubled down, insisting, "Your system must be outdated. Work community recently expanded its authority radius," repeating that imaginary phrase as if saying it enough times would make it legally binding. Officer Collins stared at him for a long second and then asked, "Do you have any documentation supporting that claim?" And Kevin opened his folder and began flipping through pages that were clearly just printed HOA bylaws, nothing more. And after a few seconds of frantic searching, he muttered, "The board hasn't issued the final paperwork yet," which was his way of saying it didn't exist. The deputy closed his notebook and said, "Sir, you need to leave this man alone. He owns the property. You have no authority here." But Kevin stepped forward, red-faced, and snapped, "This isn't over. We will not allow this kind of behavior in our community," causing Officer Collins to step between us and firmly warn, "You're bordering on harassment. Walk away." Kevin finally retreated, mumbling threats about escalating to the HOA president, and the moment he disappeared around the corner, Officer Collins turned back to me and sighed, "He might want to document everything. People like him usually get worse before they stop." And he was right, because Kevin wasn't done, not even close. And the stunt he pulled the next day proved he was willing to drag this drama into a place no sane person would ever go.
The next morning when I stepped outside expecting nothing more than cool air and maybe a quiet moment before unpacking, my jaw nearly hit the ground because sitting right in the middle of my front lawn was a giant wooden stake hammered into the soil with a bold white sign nailed to it reading, "HOA property. Trespassing will result in fines and removal." For a solid 10 seconds, I just stared at it, wondering if this was some kind of prank, because the audacity it took for Kevin to walk onto my land, hammer a stake into my grass, and claim it as HOA property was borderline unhinged, even for him. The soil around the post was still fresh, which meant he'd probably come by early morning, maybe even before sunrise, sneaking onto my property like some sort of rule-obsessed raccoon. I walked up to the sign, photographed it from every angle, and yanked it out of the ground with one hard pull, tossing it to the side.
But as soon as I did, I heard the familiar, rapid footsteps of trouble approaching, and there came Kevin, jogging toward me from the street with a breathless, furious "Hey!" like he had caught me stealing from his backyard. He pointed dramatically at the sign lying on the grass and shouted, "That was official HOA installation!" And I replied, "On my property," emphasizing the word just enough to make his eye twitch. He tried to claim that the HOA had voted that my house naturally fell under their oversight boundaries, another imaginary term he was adding to his dictionary of nonsense. And I told him point blank that if he ever stepped onto my property again without permission, I would treat it like trespassing, and I had the deputy's warning from yesterday to back me up. Kevin smirked and said, "You can't trespass from your own community," which was funny because I wasn't in his community, and I reminded him again holding the county documents right in his face. But he swatted the ear dismissively and said, "We're moving forward with formal enforcement action," like he was some government agency. I ignored his theatrics, dragged the uprooted sign to the curb, and dropped it there like trash. But Kevin snapped a dozen photos of me doing it, muttering, "Destruction of HOA property, refusing compliance, gross violation," as if he were narrating an action movie for blind listeners. I finally told him, "If you think you have a case, call whoever you need to call," and walked back toward my porch. But that only fueled him more, because Kevin wasn't the type who backed down when he felt challenged. He escalated. And sure enough, later that afternoon, I heard the sound of multiple voices outside and looked through my window to see Kevin returning with 2 more HOA board members and, unbelievably, a man carrying a measuring wheel, pacing my lawn like a land surveyor. They were talking loudly about redefining boundaries, adjusting oversight zones, and establishing compliant territory. All made-up phrases that sounded official only to them. I stepped outside and firmly told them to leave, but Kevin raised a hand and said, "We're conducting an HOA land assessment." And before I could even process how ridiculous that was, the man with the measuring wheel said, "I was told this property was disputed," which meant Kevin had hired someone under false pretenses. This wasn't just annoying anymore. It was invasive, disrespectful, and dangerously close to illegal. And as I forced them off my lawn, I could see something in Kevin's eyes shift. He wasn't just trying to enforce rules anymore. He was trying to win, no matter how far he had to push.
That night, just when I thought Kevin had reached the peak of his madness, he proved me wrong in a way I never could have predicted. I had settled in, trying to relax after the chaos of the day, when I heard a faint clinking sound outside. Quiet, metallic, and repetitive, like someone working with tools, but at nearly midnight, which immediately put me on alert. I turned off my lights, peeked the blinds, and my stomach dropped when I spotted Kevin crouched near my driveway with a toolbox open beside him, installing something into the concrete. I stepped outside with my phone recording, and the moment my porch light snapped on, Kevin jumped like he'd been caught planting evidence at a crime scene, then quickly tried to cover whatever he was doing with his body. "What are you doing?" I demanded, and Kevin, flustered but doubling down as always, said, "Installing an HOA compliant sensor," which was a phrase so ridiculous I almost burst out laughing, but then I saw the device, some kind of metal bracket with a small digital reader attached, and I wasn't laughing anymore. He was literally drilling equipment onto my driveway like he owned the place. I walked closer, and he raised his hands like I was threatening him, blurting out, "Don't interfere with official HOA installations." And I said, "You're trespassing in the middle of the night," pointing to his toolbox like it was evidence in a courtroom. Kevin puffed up his chest and said, "This driveway is part of our extended right-of-way," adding yet another phrase to his glossary of imaginary legal terms. I crouched down and inspected the bracket he'd mounted, smack in the middle of my property line, and before I could even ask what it was for, Kevin proudly announced, "This will track violations such as improper vehicle storage and driveway misuse," which translated to, he wanted a device that monitored my parking habits. I told him to remove it immediately, but Kevin said, "If you touch it, that's tampering with HOA property, punishable by fines," and I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity, because he genuinely believed this nonsense would hold up anywhere outside his delusional bubble. I lifted the device off the bracket, it wasn't even fully secured, and handed it back to him, saying, "Take your toy and leave." But Kevin snatched it like I just vandalized a national landmark, yelling, "That's destruction of compliance equipment," and threatening to escalate this to the highest board authority, whatever that meant. He gathered his tools, muttering angrily as he backed away, and before leaving he turned to shout, "You're making a huge mistake. The president will handle this." which sounded more like a villain's final warning than anything remotely official. After he disappeared into the night, I went back inside, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling in my gut. Men like Kevin didn't break into your property with tools at midnight unless they were desperate, and desperation meant escalation. And sure enough, the next morning as I stepped outside to check the damage to my driveway, a black SUV pulled up and outstepped a stern-looking man in a suit, walking with the kind of confidence that said he was either extremely important or thought he was. Kevin had finally called in his highest authority. But the HOA president didn't just come to talk. He came with a plan that was even more extreme than Kevin's.
The black SUV rolled to a slow, deliberate stop. And when the door opened, a tall, sharply dressed man stepped out with the stiff posture of someone who never bent a rule in his life. Not his own rules, anyway. Kevin followed behind him like an excited puppy, practically glowing with pride as if he'd brought in the ultimate weapon. The man introduced himself as Mr. Dalton, the HOA president, and without so much as a greeting, he scanned my property with narrowed eyes, hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield. "We need to discuss your non-compliance," he said, his voice deep and authoritative, clearly used to people backing down at its sound. But I wasn't one of those people. I crossed my arms and replied, "I don't belong to your HOA." And Kevin immediately jumped in saying, "He's been refusing every lawful notice," pointing at me like he'd uncovered a fugitive. Mr. Dalton raised a hand to silence Kevin, something I wish he'd done days earlier, and said, "Your refusal to recognize the community's authority has created significant disruption." The way he spoke made it clear that in his mind, the HOA wasn't just a neighborhood association. It was a sovereign entity, and I was a rogue nation-state threatening its stability. I calmly showed him the same documents I'd shown Officer Collins and the county clerk, but Dalton barely glanced at them before handing them back like they were worthless scraps. "The board has determined that this residence lies within our sphere of governance," he said, using yet another imaginary phrase like it was common legal terminology. I asked him to show me any record, boundary map, or legal reference proving this, and instead of answering, he pulled out a crisp folder and handed me a letter titled Notice of Immediate Compliance Review. Inside was a list, an absurdly long one, of supposed violations, including my truck being visually disruptive, my porch light being non-standard, my mailbox being unapproved style, and even my grass being the wrong shade of green. I stared at the packet, then looked back at them and said, "None of this applies to me." But Dalton responded in a firm, emotionless tone. "Failure to correct these issues within 72 hours may result in cumulative daily fines." Kevin nodded vigorously beside him, adding, "We're being generous with the timeline." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. They weren't just making things up anymore. They'd created an entire fictional legal framework and expected me to play along. I asked Mr. Dalton, "And what if I simply refuse?" And he replied without hesitation, "Then we will enforce compliance through property restrictions and accessibility control." That vague threat sent a spark of anger through me because it implied they were willing to interfere with my physical access to my own home. I stepped forward, lowering my voice, and said, "Touch anything on my property and I will treat it as criminal interference." Dalton held my gaze, unflinching, then turned and said to Kevin, "Begin preliminary action." Kevin smirked like he'd just won the first round of a war he didn't realize he was about to lose. As they walked back toward the SUV, Dalton added one final warning without turning around. "Expect further communication." And sure enough, an hour later, I heard loud metallic clangs outside, and when I rushed out, what I saw made my blood boil. The HOA had taken their preliminary action to a level I never imagined. They tried to block my property.